On the third Sunday in March, I found a long gray hair on the collar of my husband's raincoat, and it was not mine. Mine is gray as well. That is not the point. Mine has been cut short since I was 54. This one was the length of my forearm, with a soft bend near the middle, the kind hair gets when it has been pinned up all day and then taken down. I stood in our hallway with the coat still on its hook and that hair between my finger and my thumb, and the radiator ticked behind me, and I did the arithmetic a great many women have done in a hallway. 34 years married, 2 children grown and gone, a man who left the house at 7:10 every Sunday morning of his retirement and said the same 4 words on his way out. Just off to the allotment. And then I put my face against the shoulder of that coat, because I had been meaning to for weeks and had not let myself, and it smelled of the sea. I want to be careful how I tell you this, because for a long time I got it wrong, and I got it wrong in a way that felt like clear thinking the whole time I was doing it. I did not go through his phone in a rage on the first night. I collected. I noticed, and I filed, and I built, over 5 months, a case so tidy that when I finally laid it out for my oldest friend, she went quiet and then said, "Oh, Vivian," which is the sound a woman makes when your evidence is good. My name is Vivian. I am 63. I worked 29 years in the payroll office of a bus company in Marlbrook, which is not a glamorous life, but it does teach you what a pattern looks like. Give me a column of figures, and I will tell you which one is lying to me. That turned out to be exactly the trouble. I was very good at reading a column and very bad at asking a question. My husband is Douglas. He is 66. He spent his working life on plant and machinery, first on the rivers and the docks when he was young, then 30 years with the council on drainage and culverts, and he came home smelling of cold water and diesel 4 nights out of 5. He is the kind of man who will drive 200 miles to help you move a wardrobe and say nothing the whole way except that the tires want checking. The allotment came in 2016, the year he retired. Plot 41 at Netherby Road, 1 9/10 of a mile from our front door, which I know because I once measured it for a form. Runner beans, too many courgettes, a row of dahlias for me. On Sundays, he was gone from 7 until 5:30, and I did not begrudge him a minute of it, because a man who has worked outdoors for 50 years does not know what to do with himself in a warm house. The raincoat is the other thing you need to understand, because it is the whole story, really. I bought it for him in the autumn of 1989, navy blue, waxed, a storm flap and a corduroy collar, and 2 great pockets you could put a brick in. He had come home one night that October, soaked through and gray in the face, and would not eat his tea, and would not say where he had been. And the following Saturday I went into Marlbrook and bought him the best coat in the shop, and I told myself I was buying him warmth. He has worn it for 36 years. I have offered to replace it perhaps 11 times. Every time he says, "This one is fine, Viv," and every time he says it slightly too quickly, and every time I have let it go, because there is no sense in fighting a man about a coat. The smell started 2 years ago. I know that because of the Christmas before, when I was hanging up wet things and thought, "That is odd," and put it out of my head. Salt is the only word for it. If you have ever stood on a promenade in November with your collar up, you know it exactly. That cold, clean, scouring smell that gets into wool and stays. I would get a lungful of the North Sea in my own hallway, then go into the kitchen where my husband was washing his hands and say, "Good day for it," and he would say, "Not bad," and that was that. Marlbrook is 59 miles from the nearest saltwater. I want you to sit with that a moment the way I did not. The sand came in April. He had left the coat over the back of a kitchen chair, which he never does, and I picked it up to hang it and felt the weight in the right pocket. Sand. A heaped teaspoon of it in the seam, and more when I turned the pocket out onto a sheet of newspaper. Fine gray sand, almost the color of ash, so fine it went into the creases of my palm like flour. I sat at my own kitchen table and looked at it under the lamp for 10 minutes. The soil at Netherby Road is clay. Orange-brown, heavy as putty when wet, and when it dries, it goes to a rusty dust that gets in the seams of everything. I had been washing that color out of his trousers for 9 years. There was not one grain of it in that coat. So I did what I have always done with an anomaly, which is to find it an innocent home. Sand gets everywhere. Somebody will have had a load in for a path. I brushed it into the bin and did not tell him, and I want to be honest about why. It was not fear. It was because I already knew I was going to want a second one, and you cannot collect a second thing if you have made a fuss about the first. That is the moment I stopped being a wife and started being an investigator, and nobody makes an announcement when it happens. The mileage came next, and the mileage is where the ground went out from under me, because numbers are my language. We share a car, a 9-year-old estate. On the last Sunday in April, I wrote the odometer reading on the back of a gas bill before he left. 84,206. And I wrote the reading when he came back, and I sat in the driveway doing a subtraction I already knew the answer to. 118 miles. He had gone to a place 1 9/10 of a mile away and come back 118 miles later. I did it again the next Sunday, and the one after, and it never varied by more than a few miles. A wild number is a mess. A steady number is a thing a man has built. 59 miles each way. I got the road atlas out of the cupboard under the stairs and laid a piece of string on the map with one end on Marlbrook and swung it, and the string touched the coast in 3 places, and one of them was a stretch of estuary I had never once heard my husband mention in 34 years. The receipts came to me the way most things come to a woman of my age, which is by tidying. He kept them in the driver's door pocket, jammed in with the ice scraper. Fuel from a garage at Barrow Cross, a roundabout and a filling station, and nothing else, 40-odd miles out on the coast road. Always a Sunday, always between 4 and 5. There were 11 of them, and I stood in the drive and read every one, and my hands were perfectly steady, which frightened me more than shaking would have. And underneath the fuel receipts was a till slip from a builder's merchant. Denner and Rowe, Cranmouth, 4 galvanized gate hinges, a bag of postcrete, 2 lengths of tantalized timber, and a tin of exterior paint in a color called buckthorn green. 91 pounds and 60 pence, paid in cash, on a Sunday in February, in a town I had never been to in my life. What I felt was not grief, not yet. It was a kind of terrible tidiness. Everything clicked. He was on the coast every Sunday all day, buying hinges and paint for a gate that was not ours, and coming home with salt in his coat and sand in his pockets and a long gray hair on his collar. I knew what that was. Everybody knows what that is. There is a woman on the coast, and my husband has been mending her fence. Now, I could have asked him. I have gone over that 1,000 times, and still cannot explain why I did not, except to say this. When you have been married 34 years, you are not afraid of the answer. You are afraid of the question. The moment you ask it out loud, you have said that you are the sort of woman this happens to, and there is no unsaying it. So you wait. You tell yourself you are gathering. What you are actually doing is being a coward in the most organized way available to you. In May, I went to the allotments. I had not been down there in 2 years, because he always said it was a mud bath and brought the produce home in a crate. I went on a Wednesday morning with a story about needing a marrow for the church thing. Plot 41 was beautiful, and I want to say that plainly because it mattered later. The canes were up, the beans were in, the paths were swept. 9 years of work, and it was the tidiest plot on that field. And a man came along the path with a barrow, 70-odd, a woolen hat in May, and said, "You'll be after Doug." I said I was. He said, "Well, he's not here today. He's a Wednesday man mostly, Wednesdays and Fridays." And I said, "Oh, I thought Sundays." And Ted Bray, for that was his name, leaned on his barrow and said the sentence I carried around for the next 6 weeks, like a stone in my shoe. "Doug hasn't been down here of a Sunday in years, love. 2 years near enough. We used to rib him for it. Sunday used to be his day." 2 years. The same 2 years as the salt in the coat. I walked back to the car and sat in it in the lane with the engine off for 20 minutes. Here is the part I am least proud of. What I felt was not only pain. There was a thin, sharp thread of triumph running through it. I had been right. I had built a case, and the case had held, and some awful little clerk who lives inside me was pleased with herself. I would give a great deal now to go back to that lane and slap that woman. I told Peggy in June. We have known each other since we were 19 and worked the same counter at the Halifax, and there is nothing you can bring to her kitchen table that will shock her. I laid it out the way I would have laid out a payroll query. The smell, the sand, the 118 miles, Barrow Cross, the hinges, Ted Bray and the 2 years, the hair. She listened without a word, which is not like her, and then put the kettle on again, although the first had not gone cold, which is what Peggy does instead of swearing, and she said, "Oh, Vivian, love, that is not a fling. A fling is a hotel and a lie about a conference. Buying hinges is a man doing jobs round a house." Peggy was not wrong about a single fact, and she was wrong about the whole of it. You can have every detail correct and still have built your house on the wrong ground. Through that summer, I did the small, mean things, and I am not going to pretend I did not. I looked at his phone twice while he was in the bath, and both times my hands shook so badly I could barely work it. There was one number saved with no name, just the letter M, and calls to it, never long, one on a Saturday evening most weeks. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, once, 4. I sat on the edge of our bed with the water running next door and looked at that letter until it stopped looking like a letter. Then in September, I remembered the sea. It came to me in the middle of the night, the way these things do. 34 years of holidays, and not one of them at the seaside. Not one. I had wanted Whitby for our 10th. I had wanted Norfolk when the children were small, and he said the roads would be murder and booked us a fortnight in the Peak District. My sister had a flat at Redcar for 11 years, and we visited twice, and both times drove home the same night. When Hazel got married at a hotel on the front at Whitley Bay, Douglas stood with his back to the water the entire afternoon, and I said nothing, because he had a suit on, and men are odd. He cannot swim. I had known that for 34 years and thought nothing of it, because a lot of men his age cannot. He would not go in past his ankles. He would not go out on a boat at Windermere on my 60th and made a joke of it and stood on the jetty holding the coats. So there it was, sitting in the middle of my case like a stone in a sieve. A man who had refused the coast for 34 years was now driving 118 miles to it every single Sunday. I told Hazel in October. I did not mean to. My daughter rang about the boiler and asked how her dad was, and I heard myself say, "I think your father has someone else." She went very quiet and then said, "Mom, has he been strange?" And I said, "No, that is what I cannot make sense of. He has been exactly the same." And Hazel said the thing that should have stopped me and did not. She said, "That doesn't sound like a man who has fallen in love with somebody, Mum. That sounds like a man who is doing something." There is one Sunday evening in November I would take back if I could take back only one. He came in at 20 to 6 after a day of real weather, soaked, and hung the coat up and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands red raw, and he said, "That gate's straight at last." And then he hurt himself, and something went across his face, and he said, "The allotment gate, the one that drags." And I said, "Oh, good." That was all. Oh, good. I stood at my own cooker with a wooden spoon in my hand and let a man of 66 lie to me badly, and did not lift a finger to help him out of it. Then I stood in the hall while he was in the shower and put my face in that wet coat and breathed in salt, and I thought, right, enough. The following Sunday I followed him. I had told myself all week that I would not. At 7:10, I stood at the front window in my dressing gown and watched the car go up Wentworth Avenue with its lights on, and then I got dressed with my heart going like a bird. I have never followed anybody in my life. I simply drove the coast road east with the map on the seat beside me, and at 9:30 I came down the hill into Cranmouth. Cranmouth is not pretty. I had half expected pretty. It is a working village on a gray estuary, a stone jetty, a boatyard with a crane, 50 houses and terraces going up the hill. The tide was out, and the mud went for half a mile, and the light was the color of a dishcloth. And our car was parked in a lane behind the last terrace, tucked in neat against the wall, the way he always parks. I found it in 9 minutes. I sat 200 yards back with the engine off and the window down, and I could hear the sea, and faintly, somebody hammering. The cottage was the end one, low, pebbledashed, with a strip of garden at the side going down towards a track. In that garden was my husband in the navy raincoat with the hood down, on his knees, and beside him a stack of new timber, and the fence was half old and gray and half new and pale, and at the bottom of it was a gate painted a color I recognized from a till slip in a door pocket. Buckthorn green. Then the back door opened, and a woman came out with 2 mugs. Late 70s, small, in a quilted coat and Wellingtons, and her hair long and gray, and pinned up loosely with a good deal of it coming down. He got up off his knees and took a mug. They stood in the wind, not touching, and after a while she said something and he laughed, and I heard it across 200 yards of a Sunday morning, the sound of my husband laughing on a coast he had refused to take me to for 34 years. And then she went in and came back with a plate of something, and she put her hand flat on his back for a second as she passed it to him, and it was not the hand of a lover. I knew it the instant I saw it. It was the hand you put on the back of somebody at a funeral. I got out of the car. I walked down that lane and my legs did not feel like mine, and I stopped at the new green gate, and the hinges were so new they still had that oily shine, and Douglas turned round with a mug in his hand. I have seen my husband's face in a great many weathers. I have never seen it do what it did then. It did not go guilty. What went across it was far worse and far quieter. He looked like a man who has been carrying something a long way and has just been told he can put it down, and does not know if he can bear to. He said, "Viv." And the woman looked at me, and looked at him, and said in a plain, flat, coastal voice, "Oh, Douglas, you never told her." Her name was Marion Tully, and she made me a cup of tea in a kitchen with a boiler that knocked, and I sat with my handbag on my knees like a woman come about the insurance, and Douglas stood at the sink with his back to the room, which is the only way he has ever been able to say anything. Marion said, "Did he tell you about the barge?" And I said, "I do not know what you mean." And she looked at my husband's back for a long moment, and then she said, "In 1989, my husband Ray went into the water off a works barge on this estuary, and he drowned. And your Douglas was on that barge, and he was the one holding the line." I had never heard the word barge come out of my husband's mouth. Not once. I knew he had done river work before the council. He had said, "The rivers," and I had a picture of dredgers and mud and men shouting, and that was the whole of it. I knew he started with the council in 1990, and I had always assumed it was because the pay was better. 1989. October of 1989. The autumn he came home, soaked and gray, and would not eat his tea, and would not tell me where he had been. And I went into Marlbrook that Saturday and bought him a good navy raincoat because I thought he was cold. He wore it for 36 years and would never let me buy him another. Douglas told me the rest that night, in a lay-by on the coast road with the heater running and the windows going white, because he could not do it in front of her. He was fine, and then he was not fine, and I had never in my life heard the sound he made in that car. They were putting in new piling along the quay wall at Cranmouth. A contractor out of Hull, 6 men and a foreman, working off a flatworks barge tied alongside. October, cold enough that the ropes went stiff in your hands. Douglas was 29. Ray Tooley was 41, had been doing it 20 years, and used to bring a flask of oxtail soup and hand it round. Ray went over the side to clear a fouled chain from a shackle at the waterline, on a short ladder, on a line. And the rule, the actual rule, the one that got said every morning, was that a man on that line was held. Not made off, held. A hand on it the whole time, so that if he went, you had him in the first second. And Douglas made it off to a cleat and went below for 4 minutes. He has told me why more than once, and it has never got any better. His hands were cold. He wanted a cigarette and a warm at the galley stove. He had done it before, and so had every man on that boat, and nothing had ever happened. And any inspector in the country would have said that rope was adequately secured. The chain came away wrong and took Ray off the ladder sideways, and he went down between the barge and the quay wall, and the line paid off the cleat because a cleat is not a man's hand, and by the time Douglas came up the ladder with his cigarette in his mouth, there was nothing in the water but the line going slack. He went in after him. My husband, who cannot swim, went into an October estuary between a steel barge and a stone wall, and they got him out with a boat hook, and they did not get Ray out at all. They found him 3 days later, 2 miles down on the mudflats. There was an inquest in the January. Misadventure. The foreman gave evidence that the line was made off at the cleat in accordance with practice, and that was the truth, and nobody asked the one question that mattered, which was whether anybody had a hand on it. Douglas sat in that room in a borrowed tie and was not asked, and so he did not say. That is my husband's secret, the one that put salt in a coat and 118 miles on a car. He was not asked, and so he did not say, and then it was 30 years too late. He went to the funeral. He stood at the back of the church at Cranmouth in a black coat borrowed off his brother and left before the end because he could not go to the house afterwards, and Marion Tully, 29 herself, with 2 boys under 7, saw a young man at the back who left and remembered him for 34 years without knowing why. In 1990, he took the council job, which was drains and culverts and inland water and no salt in it anywhere, and he married me in 1991, and he never went to the coast again. And I planned holidays around a man's silence for 3 decades and called it his funny way. Now here's the part that undid me. 2 years ago, Douglas had a stent put in, 90 minutes in a cath lab at the General and home the next day, and he made nothing of it. About a fortnight after, he sat in the car outside the house for a long time before coming in, and I thought, he is tired. He had driven to Cranmouth. He had looked at an inquest report at a library in a town he did not live in, found a name and then a phone book, and driven 59 miles to knock on a door and tell a widow, 32 years late, that he had gone below for 4 minutes. And he stood at that gate, and he could not do it. She came out. He said, "My name is Douglas Headley. I worked on the barge." And she looked at him a while and then said, "You were at the back of the church." And then, because she was 75 and it was February, and her life was that of a woman on her own in a cold house, she said the gate had been dropping for 4 winters, and the fence had gone at the bottom where the wind comes off the mud, and she supposed nobody knew anybody who did that sort of thing anymore. And my husband said, "I could look at that." A man drove 59 miles to confess and was handed a dropped gate instead, and he took it because a gate is a thing you can do with your hands, and the sentence he had come to say was one he had never once been able to get out of his mouth in 3 decades. 2 years of Sundays. The gate, then the fence, then the shed roof, the guttering, a step at the back door because her hip had gone. When the jobs ran out, he came anyway, and they would sit in that kitchen and talk about her boys and his knees, and then he would find something else that wanted doing, because he could not sit in a chair in that house without a reason. He never told her. 2 years, every Sunday, and he never once said the 4 minutes out loud. He was mending a fence in the hope that it would count. And he could not tell me, and this is where I have had to be fair to him, even when I did not want to be. He could not tell me about Marion without telling me about the barge, and he had never told me about the barge. Not in 1991, when I would have held him. Not in any of 10,000 ordinary evenings since. It had gone past being a secret and become a foundation. You cannot pull a thing like that out from under a house after 30 years and expect the house to stand. He said to me in that lay-by, "If I had told you at the start, you would have married me anyway." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "That is why. I understand it now, though understanding is not the same as being at peace with it." He did not think I would leave him. He thought I would stay and look at him and be kind, and that his own wife's kindness would be the thing he could not survive. So he kept me on the outside of it. For 34 years, I was the room he kept clean. And what about my evidence? Every clue was correct. The salt was the estuary, the gray sand was the flats at the end of that track, and it was in his pockets because he had been kneeling in it, digging post holes. The miles were real. The hinges were real. The cash was because he did not want a card statement raising a question he could not answer. Ted Bray was right, and the plot was immaculate because he did it Wednesdays and Fridays like a man serving 2 sentences. and M was Marion, and those Saturday calls were my husband ringing an old woman to say, "I will be down about 9:30. Do you want anything bringing?" Every fact was right, and I had assembled them into a woman on the coast, because that is the shape my mind had ready. We do not really investigate. We recognize. We take a handful of true things and press them into the mold we are already holding, and we call the result a conclusion. But there was one that never fitted, and I had it in my hand in March, and I put it in the wrong pile. The hair. It was long and gray, and it was on the outside of the collar, high up on the corduroy, and it had been there long enough to be worked into the nap. A man who is hiding an affair brushes his coat. He does. He checks himself in the mirror in the hall before he opens his own front door. He knows exactly which small betrayals a coat can carry, because a guilty man is nothing but attention. He empties his pockets. He hangs the coat where the light is poor. He would never in 100 years walk into his wife's hallway carrying another woman's hair on his shoulder like a decoration. Douglas walked in with it because it had never once crossed his mind that anything about that day needed hiding from view. He was not concealing an affair. He was carrying a grief, and grief does not check itself in the hall mirror. It goes straight up the stairs in its boots. The hair got there because Marion Tully had put her arms round his neck on a doorstep in the rain, the way a woman of 77 does to a man who has just fixed her gutter. That is all it ever was. The one detail I could not explain was the one telling me the truth the whole time, and I had filed it under proof. I would like to tell you that this ended tidily. It did not. I was angry for a long while, and the anger was not about Marion at all. It was about the 34 years. I would look at him across a table and think, I held your hand at both our mother's gravesides, and the biggest thing that ever happened to you was a room I was not allowed into. That took the best part of a year, and there were nights in the spare room and a spring where we spoke like polite neighbors. And in the April, I made him tell her. I sat in that kitchen with the knocking boiler and said, Marion, Douglas has something he came here to say 2 years ago, and he stood at that sink with his back to us both and said it. The cleat, the 4 minutes, the cigarette. He said it all in about 40 seconds, which is a very short time for 34 years. She did not forgive him on the spot. People expect that, and it is not what happens. She sat very still, and then she cried, and it was not gentle, and Douglas stood and took it, which is the only useful thing he could have done. After a while she said, He'd have gone anyway, Douglas. That chain took him sideways. And then she said, But you should have said. Both were true at once, and they have to be allowed to be. She did not tell him it was all right. She made him a sandwich, which in a house like that is not nothing. Marion had a bad stroke in the October and went to her elder son in Doncaster, and the cottage was sold in the spring to a couple who took the fence down within the month because they wanted a view of the mud. She died last February. We sat 4 rows back at the funeral, and I held his hand through it, and he did not cry at that one either, but he cried on the way home near Barrow Cross and had to pull in. He still has the raincoat. I have stopped offering to replace it. I understand now that it is not a coat, it is a date, and there is no sense in fighting a man about a date. We go to the coast now. That is the one plain good thing I can give you. Twice last year, a little hotel at Whitby, and he walked the front with me with the water on his right-hand side, and it took him until the second afternoon to look at it properly. He still will not go in past his ankles. I do not suppose he ever will. What I want to leave you with is the hair, because it is the whole thing. For 5 months I built a case out of a smell and a mileage and a receipt, and every brick in it was sound, and the house I built was a lie. And the one thing that would not sit flush was the piece I had put in wrong, not the hair itself, the fact that he had not brushed it off. We are all so certain we would notice. The perfume, the phone turned face down, the new shirt. What we do not notice is the absence of care. The lie that is not being told carefully. The man who comes home smelling of the sea and does not bother to check the mirror because he does not know he has anything to hide from you, only something he cannot say to you. So if you ever find yourself with a case as tidy as mine was, take out the one detail that does not fit and hold it up to the light on its own before you file it. Do not ask what it proves. Ask what it would take for it to be innocent. Because usually the small wrong thing is not the crack in his story, it is the crack in yours.